The cursor blinked on my phone screen as I stared at those three words that would shatter everything. Wedding is off. My thumb hovered over the send button while rain pelted against the hotel window. In 18 hours, 120 guests were supposed to watch me marry Mike Thompson at St. Mary's Community Church. My white dress hung on the closet door like a ghost, and my mother's voice echoed in my head from our conversation an hour ago when she said those words that still made my stomach churn. But what I discovered about Mike in the next 24 hours would prove that sometimes the worst moments of your life are actually saving you from something far more devastating. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Johnson, and 2 days ago I thought I had my entire future mapped out. I was going to marry the man my mother called perfect husband material in front of half of Riverside, Ohio, in what Linda Johnson had been planning as the social event of the season. Mike Thompson was everything on paper that a 26-year-old marketing coordinator from a middle-class family could want. He was handsome with those warm brown eyes and easy smile that made elderly ladies at the grocery store comment on what beautiful children we'd have. He had a steady job as the top sales manager at Riverside Auto Sales, pulling in decent money that would complement my modest salary at Peterson Marketing Group. He came from a good working-class family, the Thompsons, who owned their own home in Cedar Point and had raised 3 successful children. Most importantly to my mother, he was ready to settle down, get married, buy a house in the right neighborhood, and start the kind of stable life that looked impressive to the country club crowd she desperately wanted to impress. The Grandview Hotel suite felt suffocating as I stared at my phone, even though Linda had insisted on booking the bridal suite for our wedding weekend. The walls were decorated in soft pastels that should have felt romantic, but instead felt like a prison painted in wedding colors. Just hours earlier, I had been having my final dress fitting with my maid of honor, Jessica Martinez, laughing about how nervous I was while she adjusted my veil and told me that pre-wedding jitters were completely normal. Jessica had been my best friend since college, and she was the one person who always told me the truth, even when it hurt. She had been the one to ask me the question that started this whole nightmare unraveling. We were sitting in the bridal suite, surrounded by bags from the rehearsal dinner and boxes of wedding favors that my mother had spent weeks assembling. Jessica was painting her nails the soft pink color that would complement her maid of honor dress, and I was going through my checklist one final time, making sure every detail was perfect for tomorrow's ceremony. The rain had started that evening, and I was already worrying about whether we'd need to move the outdoor photo session inside when Jessica looked up from her manicure and asked the question that changed everything. "Emma, can I ask you something? And will you promise to give me an honest answer?" She set down the nail polish bottle and turned to face me completely, her expression more serious than I had seen it in months. "When you think about marrying Mike tomorrow, what's the first emotion that comes up? Not what you think you should feel, not what everyone expects you to feel, but what actually happens in your chest when you picture walking down that aisle." I opened my mouth to give her the answer I had been rehearsing for months. Excitement, joy, love. The words that every bride was supposed to feel, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way she was looking at me, or maybe it was the fact that we were finally alone after weeks of constant wedding preparations and family obligations. Instead of the practiced response, I felt something else entirely. A heavy weight in my stomach. A tightness in my throat. The same feeling I got when I had to give a presentation at work that I wasn't prepared for. "I feel terrified," I heard myself say, and the honesty of it surprised me. Not nervous terrified, but genuinely scared. Like I'm about to make a huge mistake, but everyone's watching and it's too late to stop it. Jessica nodded slowly as if this wasn't a surprise to her. "How long have you felt like that?" The question hung in the air between us. When had it started? The doubts had been creeping in for weeks. Little moments that I had pushed aside because everyone kept telling me that cold feet were normal. The way Mike had become increasingly distant as the wedding approached, the strange phone calls he took in the other room, the way he seemed to have developed a whole new group of friends that I had never met, people he would mention casually but never invite me to hang out with. Most troubling of all was the conversation we had 3 weeks ago about our wedding guest list. Mike had been acting strange about his side of the guest list, and when I asked him about inviting some of his coworkers from the dealership, he had gotten defensive in a way that was completely unlike him. He said that he preferred to keep work and personal life separate, which seemed odd considering that my entire office was invited to the wedding. When I pressed him about it, he had snapped at me for the first time in our entire relationship, saying that I was being controlling and that he should be able to invite whoever he wanted to his own wedding. "Emma," Jessica said gently, "have you actually been to his workplace? Like recently?" The question caught me off guard. Well, no. He always...
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The dealership is crazy busy, and he doesn't want me to bother him while he's working. But I drove by there last week to surprise him with lunch, and I didn't see his car in the parking lot. What did you do? I called him, and he said he was at an off-site meeting with a customer, but something about it felt wrong. His voice sounded weird, like he was lying about something. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her weighing her words carefully. Finally, she said, "Emma, I think you need to trust your instincts here. If something feels wrong, maybe it is wrong." That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I told Jessica that I needed to know the truth, whatever it was, before I walked down that aisle tomorrow. We decided that I would go to Mike's townhouse that night after the rehearsal dinner and have an honest conversation with him about all my concerns. If there were reasonable explanations for everything, then I would feel better about getting married. If there weren't, then at least I would know the truth before making the biggest commitment of my life. The rehearsal dinner at Miller's Diner had been everything my mother wanted it to be. She had chosen the restaurant because it was where the country club crowd went for casual family celebrations, and she had spent weeks planning every detail from the menu to the seating chart. Mike had seemed relaxed and happy, joking with the groomsmen and charming my relatives with stories about our relationship. Watching him that night, I almost convinced myself that my doubts were just pre-wedding nerves after all. He was attentive and affectionate, holding my hand under the table and whispering little jokes in my ear that made me laugh. But then, as we were saying goodbye in the parking lot, something happened that brought all my concerns rushing back. Mike's phone rang, and when he looked at the screen, his entire demeanor changed. His face went pale, and he stepped away from our group to take the call. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could see his body language, and he looked panicked. When he came back, he said it was a work emergency and that he needed to go handle something at the dealership. He kissed me quickly and said he would see me at the altar tomorrow, but there was something in his eyes that looked almost like guilt. That's when I decided I couldn't wait until tomorrow to get answers. I told my parents and Jessica that I was going back to my hotel to get some rest, but instead I drove to Mike's townhouse in Cedar Point. His car wasn't in the driveway, which was strange because he had just said he was going to work. I sat in my car for almost an hour, trying to decide what to do when I saw his headlights turning into the development. But he wasn't alone. There was a woman in the passenger seat, and when they got out of the car, I could see that they were holding hands. My heart started pounding as I watched them walk to his front door together, and I felt like I was going to be sick. This was it. This was the confirmation of everything I had been afraid of. Mike was cheating on me, and I was supposed to marry him in less than 18 hours. I sat in my car shaking, trying to decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to march up to the door and confront them both right there. Part of me wanted to drive home and pretend I had never seen anything. But the rational part of my brain knew that I needed proof, and I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I made any decisions about the wedding. I waited until the lights went on in his living room, and then I crept up to the window. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. Mike was sitting on his couch with this woman, and they were looking through what appeared to be wedding planning materials. Not our wedding planning materials, but different ones. Different venues, different flowers, different everything. They were planning a wedding together, and it wasn't the one that was supposed to happen tomorrow. The woman was beautiful, probably around my age, with long dark hair and an engagement ring that caught the light when she moved her hands. She was pregnant, visibly pregnant, probably about 6 months along, and the way Mike was touching her belly, the way he was looking at her, made it clear that this wasn't just an affair. This was his real life, and I was something else entirely. I took pictures with my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. I needed evidence of what I was seeing because I knew that no one would believe this story without proof. Mike Thompson, the perfect husband material that my mother adored, was already engaged to someone else and about to become a father. Our entire relationship, our entire engagement, our wedding tomorrow, it was all a lie. I drove back to the hotel in a daze, my mind racing with questions and implications. How long had this been going on? Who was this woman? Why was he marrying me if he was already committed to someone else? Was this some kind of elaborate con, or was there something else I wasn't understanding? Back in the bridal suite, I stared at the photos on my phone, trying to make sense of what I had seen.
The woman in the pictures looked familiar, but I couldn't place where I might have seen her before. She was wearing scrubs in one of the photos, so she was probably a nurse or some kind of medical professional. The engagement ring on her finger was beautiful, but not expensive, the kind of ring that someone would buy when they were truly in love but didn't have a lot of money. That's when I remembered something that made my stomach drop even farther. 3 months ago, Mike had asked me if I would be okay with him taking a second job to help pay for wedding expenses. He said a friend of his had offered him some part-time work doing medical equipment sales, and it would mean some evening and weekend hours, but the extra money would really help us get started in our marriage. I had thought it was sweet that he wanted to contribute more to our future, and I had encouraged him to take the opportunity. Now I realized that the second job probably didn't exist. The evening and weekend hours were time he was spending with his pregnant fiancée, and the extra money he claimed to be making was probably coming from somewhere else entirely. Maybe he was living off her income. Maybe there were other women involved. Maybe our entire relationship was part of some larger pattern of deception that I was just beginning to understand. I scrolled through my phone, looking at our text message history, trying to find clues that I had missed. The late-night work calls that had become more frequent over the past few months, the weekend trips he had taken for training seminars that I was never invited to, the way he had become vague about his family, saying that they were too busy to get together but that they were excited about the wedding. I had met his mother Carol and brother Daniel a few times, but Mike always seemed eager to keep those visits short, saying that his family was private and didn't like to get too involved in his personal life. Now I wondered if his family even knew about me. Maybe they knew about the pregnant woman instead. Maybe I was the secret, not her. The more I thought about it, the more pieces started falling into place. The reason Mike didn't want me to visit him at work wasn't because he was busy. It was because he probably didn't work there at all. The reason he was hesitant about moving in together wasn't because he was being practical. It was because he was already living with someone else. The reason he kept our relationship somewhat separate from his family and friends wasn't because he was private. It was because he was living a double life. I felt like an idiot for not seeing it sooner, but I also felt angry at how elaborate his deception had been. This wasn't just a guy who was cheating on his girlfriend. This was someone who had constructed an entire false identity and maintained it for months while planning to marry me under completely false pretenses. The level of manipulation and dishonesty was staggering. That's when I typed those 3 words that would change everything. Wedding is off. But before I could send the message to our wedding coordinator, I knew I needed to call my mother. Linda Johnson had invested so much of herself in this wedding, both financially and emotionally, and she deserved to know what was happening before she found out from someone else. I looked at the clock on my phone. It was almost midnight, but I knew my mother would still be awake. She had been too excited about the wedding to sleep properly for the past week, and she was probably doing last-minute preparations or going over her timeline for tomorrow one final time. I took a deep breath and dialed her number, preparing myself for what was going to be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. The phone rang 3 times before my mother's voice cut through the silence, bright and energetic despite the late hour. "Emma, sweetheart, I was just going over the seating chart one more time. Mrs. Henderson from the country club called to confirm that she's bringing her nephew from Columbus, so I had to rearrange table 6. Are you getting enough rest? Tomorrow is going to be absolutely perfect, and I want you to look radiant walking down that aisle." I closed my eyes, trying to find the words to shatter her excitement. "Mom, we need to talk. Something's happened." There was a pause, and I could hear her setting something down, probably the wedding timeline she had been obsessing over for weeks. "What do you mean something's happened? Is it the flowers? I told you we should have gone with Peterson's florist instead of that new place downtown. Or is it the weather? The rain is supposed to stop by morning, honey." "Mom, it's about Mike." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "The wedding isn't going to happen tomorrow." Silence stretched between us, and I could almost see her face in my mind, the way her eyebrows would furrow when she was trying to process information that didn't make sense to her. Linda Johnson was a woman who liked everything to go according to plan, and unexpected problems were not part of her vocabulary. "What are you talking about, Emma? Did you two have a fight?" Honey, every couple argues right before their wedding. It's perfectly normal. Your father and I had the biggest fight of our lives the night before we got married, and look how wonderfully everything turned out. I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to say would devastate her. Mom, Mike is engaged to someone else. She's pregnant with his baby. I saw them together tonight, planning their own wedding. The silence that followed was different this time, heavier and more ominous. When my mother finally spoke, her voice had changed completely. The excitement was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating that I had heard before, but never directed at me. Well, she said slowly, and I could hear her taking a breath. Maybe you finally came to your senses. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had expected shock, anger, devastation, demands for details about what I had seen. I had prepared myself to comfort her through the embarrassment and financial loss. What I hadn't expected was relief in her voice, as if this disaster was somehow a good thing. What did you just say? Emma, I said maybe you finally came to your senses. If Mike Thompson is the kind of man who would cheat on you and lie to you, then obviously this marriage was never going to work out. You're better off finding out now than after you've legally tied yourself to him. I felt like I was in some kind of alternate reality where my status-obsessed mother was calmly accepting the destruction of the social event she had been planning for 8 months. Linda Johnson, who had spent thousands of dollars we didn't really have on this wedding, who had bragged to everyone at the country club about her daughter's perfect fiancé, who had already started planning what she called the grandchildren strategy for social advancement, was acting like calling off the wedding 12 hours before the ceremony was a rational decision. Mom, I don't understand. Yesterday, you were telling me how perfect Mike was, how lucky I was to find someone so stable and successful. You said he was exactly the kind of husband you had always hoped I would find. That was before I knew he was a cheater and a liar, she said matter-of-factly. Emma, you know I've always wanted what's best for you. If this man is not trustworthy, then he's not what's best for you. Something in her tone made my stomach twist with suspicion. My mother's sudden acceptance of this disaster was completely out of character, and the more I thought about it, the more wrong it felt. Linda Johnson didn't handle unexpected problems with calm rationality. She handled them with phone calls, demands for solutions, and elaborate backup plans. The fact that she wasn't freaking out about the financial loss, the social embarrassment, or the logistics of canceling everything made me wonder if this wasn't as unexpected to her as I had assumed. Mom, how long have you known? Another pause. Known what, sweetheart? How long have you known about Mike? Emma, I don't know what you're implying, but I just found out about this situation when you called me. I'm simply trying to support your decision to call off the wedding. But there was something in her voice, a careful quality, that reminded me of the tone she used with difficult real estate clients when she was trying to manage a situation without revealing too much information. Linda Johnson was a skilled negotiator, and I had heard her use this exact voice to navigate complicated deals where everyone had secrets they didn't want exposed. Mom, I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you know that Mike was involved with someone else?
Someone else? The silence stretched so long that I thought the call might have been dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter and more defensive. Emma, I may have heard some rumors, but I didn't think they were reliable. You know how people talk in a small town. What kind of rumors? Nothing concrete, just some gossip at the country club about Mike being seen around town with a woman. But people see things and make assumptions, and I didn't want to upset you based on unsubstantiated gossip. I felt my anger building. So you heard that my fiancé might be cheating on me, and you decided not to tell me? I heard rumors, Emma. Rumors that could have been completely false. And I made the decision that it was better to let you be happy than to worry you unnecessarily about something that might not even be true. But you just said that maybe I finally came to my senses. That doesn't sound like someone who thought the rumors were false.
I could hear her sigh through the phone. Emma, I've been watching you for the past few months, and you haven't seemed happy. You've seemed stressed and anxious, and I wondered if you were having doubts about Mike. When you called tonight, my first thought was that you had figured out that he wasn't right for you. So you were hoping I would call off the wedding? I was hoping you would make the right decision for yourself, whatever that turned out to be. This conversation was becoming more surreal by the minute. My mother, who had spent months planning every detail of this wedding, who had borrowed money against the house to pay for the reception, who had invited half of Riverside's social elite to watch her daughter marry the perfect man, was now claiming that she had been hoping I would cancel everything? Mom, what aren't you telling me? Emma, I think you should focus on taking care of yourself right now. This has been a difficult evening for you, and you need to get some rest. We can talk about all the details tomorrow. What details? What aren't you telling me about Mike? Sweetheart, you've already discovered the most important thing, which is that he's not the man he pretended to be. The rest of it doesn't matter now. The rest of what? But my mother had already hung up. I stared at my phone in disbelief. Not only had my mother known that Mike might be cheating on me, but there was apparently more to the story that she wasn't telling me. The rest of what? What else was there to discover about the man I had been planning to marry? I tried calling her back, but it went straight to voicemail. Linda Johnson had turned off her phone, which was something she never did during wedding weekend. My mother was always available for wedding emergencies, but now, when I needed answers more than I had ever needed anything, she was suddenly unreachable. The hotel room felt smaller and more oppressive than before. I walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot where a few cars sat under the streetlights in the rain. Somewhere in this town, Mike Thompson was probably lying next to his pregnant fiancée, completely unaware that I had discovered his secret. Somewhere else, my mother was probably lying awake knowing that she had just revealed more than she intended to about her own involvement in this situation. I realized that I didn't really know either of them as well as I thought I did. Mike had been living a complete double life for months, maintaining an elaborate deception that required constant lies and careful scheduling. My mother had been aware of at least some of his deception and had chosen to keep that information from me while continuing to plan and pay for a wedding that she apparently didn't want to happen. The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. If my mother had heard rumors about Mike, where had those rumors come from? The country club crowd wasn't usually interested in the personal lives of working-class men like Mike unless there was something particularly scandalous about the situation. What had made Mike's affair interesting enough to gossip about at the country club? And why had my mother been so quick to assume that my call meant I had come to my senses? Her immediate response suggested that she had been expecting this call, or at least hoping for it. That wasn't the reaction of someone who had just heard devastating news about her daughter's fiancé. That was the reaction of someone who had been waiting for her daughter to figure out something that she already knew. I pulled up my laptop and started doing something I probably should have done months ago. I started researching Mike Thompson. If my mother knew things about him that she wasn't telling me, and if there were rumors about him circulating around town, then there might be information available that I had never bothered to look for because I had trusted him completely. The first thing I discovered was that Mike Thompson wasn't listed as an employee at Riverside Auto Sales. Their website had a staff directory, and his name wasn't on it. I called their after-hours number and navigated through their automated directory, but there was no extension for Mike Thompson. I searched for his name on professional networking sites, and while there were several Mike Thompsons in Ohio, none of them matched the man I was engaged to. It was as if his professional identity he had created for himself didn't exist anywhere outside of his own claims. I thought about all the times he had told me stories about his work, about difficult customers and successful sales and office politics. Had all of those stories been completely fabricated? If he didn't work at the dealership, where did he spend his days? I searched for his address on property records and discovered that the townhouse he lived in wasn't owned or rented by him. It was owned by someone named Patricia Thompson, who was probably his mother, though he had always told me that his parents lived in a different part of town. More lies, or at least more careful omissions of the truth. Then I searched for news articles mentioning his name, and that's when things got really interesting. There were several articles from local newspapers over the past 2 years that mentioned Mike Thompson in connection with various community events and charitable activities. But the Mike Thompson in these articles wasn't described as a car salesman. He was described as a volunteer coordinator for the Riverside Emergency Response Team. The emergency response team was a group of local volunteers who helped during natural disasters, medical emergencies, and other crisis situations. According to the articles, Mike had been volunteering with them for almost 3 years, and he had recently been promoted to a leadership position that involved coordinating volunteer schedules and training new members. This was starting to make more sense. If Mike was a volunteer coordinator for the emergency response team,
The emergency response team. That would explain the irregular hours and the frequent evening and weekend commitments. It would also explain why he had access to medical facilities and why the woman I had seen him with was wearing scrubs. If she worked at the hospital and he coordinated emergency volunteers, they would have had plenty of opportunities to meet and work together. But it still didn't explain why he had lied to me about his job, or why he was engaged to two different women at the same time. If anything, being a volunteer coordinator was more admirable than being a car salesman. Why would he create a false professional identity when the truth was more impressive? I kept searching and found a local newspaper article from 6 months ago about a fundraising event for the emergency response team. There was a photo accompanying the article, and I recognized Mike immediately. But the woman standing next to him in the photo, identified in the caption as Sarah Chen, the team's medical coordinator, was not the pregnant woman I had seen at his house tonight. Sarah Chen was older, probably in her 40s, with short gray hair and a professional demeanor. She was described in the article as a nurse practitioner who had been volunteering with the emergency response team for 5 years. If Mike was having an affair with someone from the emergency response team, it apparently wasn't with Sarah Chen. I downloaded the photo and studied it carefully. Mike looked happy and relaxed, and he was wearing a volunteer uniform that I had never seen before. His arm was around Sarah Chen's shoulders in a casual, friendly way that suggested they had worked together for a long time. There were other volunteers in the background of the photo, and everyone looked like they were part of a close-knit team. This version of Mike looked like the man I had fallen in love with. Confident but not arrogant, friendly but not fake, someone who was genuinely committed to helping his community. It was so different from the deceptive person I had discovered tonight that it was hard to believe they were the same person. I scrolled through more articles and found another photo from a different event 3 months ago. This time, Mike was standing with a group of younger volunteers, and one of them was a woman who looked familiar. She had long, dark hair and was wearing scrubs, and while the photo was taken from a distance, I was pretty sure she was the pregnant woman I had seen at Mike's house. The caption identified her as Amanda Rodriguez, a pediatric nurse who had recently joined the volunteer team. The article mentioned that she had moved to Riverside from Columbus after finishing her nursing degree, and that she was particularly interested in emergency pediatric care. Amanda Rodriguez. I stared at her name on the screen, trying to process what this meant. If Mike was involved with Amanda Rodriguez through the emergency response team, and if they had been working together for several months, then their relationship might have developed gradually through their volunteer work rather than being a random affair. That still didn't explain why he was engaged to both of us, but it did suggest that his feelings for Amanda might be genuine rather than purely opportunistic. People who volunteered for emergency response work were usually driven by a real desire to help others, and relationships that formed in that context often had a strong emotional foundation. I found Amanda Rodriguez on social media and spent some time looking through her public posts. She seemed like a genuinely nice person who was passionate about her work as a pediatric nurse. Her posts were mostly about her patients, her volunteer work, and her pregnancy. She was clearly excited about becoming a mother, and several of her recent posts mentioned how grateful she was for the support of her fiancé, though she never mentioned him by name or tagged him in any photos.
Looking at her social media presence, I felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for her. Amanda Rodriguez had no idea that the man she was planning to marry was already engaged to someone else. She was building a life and planning a future with someone who was living a complete lie, just like I had been. She was as much a victim of Mike's deception as I was. But that raised even more questions about Mike's motivations and mental state. How do you maintain two separate relationships with two different women while planning to marry both of them? How do you look at a pregnant woman who trusts you completely and continue lying to her every single day? How do you plan one wedding while already engaged in another relationship? The level of compartmentalization and deception required to maintain this double life was staggering. It wasn't just that Mike had been unfaithful. He had constructed two entirely separate identities and maintained them simultaneously for months. That suggested either a level of psychological manipulation that bordered on sociopathy, or someone who was in such deep emotional trouble that he couldn't figure out how to tell the truth to anyone about anything. I thought about all the conversations we had had about our future together. Mike had seemed genuinely excited about getting married and starting a life with me. He had talked about wanting children and buying a house and all the normal things that couples plan together. Had any of that been real, or had it all been part of an elaborate performance? And what about Amanda? Was he having the same conversations with her about their future together? Was he telling her the same things he had told me about wanting to build a stable, loving life together? I looked at the clock and realized that it was almost 2 in the morning. In 14 hours, 120 people were supposed to arrive at St. Mary's Community Church expecting to watch a wedding that was never going to happen. I needed to start making phone calls and sending messages to cancel everything, but I was paralyzed by all the unanswered questions about Mike and my mother and what the hell was really going on in this situation. The wedding coordinator was going to be furious. The caterer would probably keep our deposit. The florist had already delivered the arrangements to the church. The photographer was probably already packing her equipment for tomorrow's shoot. All of these people had planned their weekend around our wedding, and now I was going to have to tell them that it was all based on a lie. But before I could start making those calls, I needed to understand what my mother knew and why she had been so quick to accept the cancellation. Her reaction had been so far out of character that I was beginning to suspect she knew much more about Mike than she had admitted. And if she knew more about Mike, then she might also know more about why he had been living this double life.
I tried calling her again, but her phone was still going straight to voicemail. I considered driving to my parents' house and demanding answers, but I wasn't sure I was emotionally stable enough to have that confrontation in person. Instead, I decided to text her a message that would make it clear that I knew she was hiding something. Mom, I know you know more about Mike than you told me. I found out about his volunteer work and about Amanda Rodriguez. If you want me to trust you ever again, you need to tell me the truth about what you knew and when you knew it. I sent the message and waited, but there was no immediate response. Linda Johnson was apparently planning to stick with her strategy of avoiding difficult conversations until she absolutely couldn't avoid them anymore. While I waited to hear back from my mother, I decided to do more research about the emergency response team. If Mike and Amanda had met through volunteer work, then there might be other people involved who could help me understand how their relationship had developed and whether Mike had been honest with any of them about his situation. The emergency response team had a website with information about their activities and volunteer opportunities. They met twice a month for training sessions, and they were called out for emergencies on an as-needed basis. According to their mission statement, they provided support for everything from severe weather events to medical emergencies to search and rescue operations. It was exactly the kind of organization that would attract someone like Mike, someone who wanted to make a difference in his community and who was good in crisis situations. During our relationship, I had noticed that Mike was particularly calm and competent when things went wrong. When my car broke down on the highway, he had known exactly what to do and who to call. When my elderly neighbor had fallen in her garden, Mike had been the one to assess her injuries and coordinate with the paramedics. I had always admired those qualities in him, and now I realized that they probably came from his volunteer training. Mike wasn't just naturally good in emergencies, he had been trained to handle them.
That made his ability to compartmentalize and manage multiple complex situations make more sense, even if it didn't excuse his dishonesty. I found a contact form on the emergency response team website and considered sending a message to ask about Mike's involvement with the organization. But I wasn't sure what I would say or whether it would be appropriate to involve his volunteer colleagues in what was obviously a personal crisis. Instead, I decided to look up Sarah Chen, the medical coordinator who had been standing next to Mike in the newspaper photo. If she had been working with him for several years, she might have insights into his character and his recent behavior that could help me understand what had gone wrong. Sarah Chen had a professional profile on a medical networking site that listed her credentials and experience. She had been a nurse practitioner for over 15 years, specializing in emergency and trauma care. Her profile mentioned her volunteer work with the Riverside Emergency Response Team and described her as someone who was particularly skilled at training new volunteers and coordinating medical response efforts. She seemed like exactly the kind of person who would have a good sense of whether someone was trustworthy and reliable. If Mike had been behaving erratically or dishonestly in his volunteer work, Sarah Chen would probably have noticed and addressed it. I found her personal email address through the Nursing Association directory and spent 20 minutes composing a message that explained my situation without going into too much detail about the personal drama. I told her that I was Mike Thompson's fiancé and that I had discovered some information that made me question his honesty about other aspects of his life. I asked if she would be willing to have a brief conversation about his character and reliability as a volunteer. After sending the email, I felt like I had done as much research as I could for one night. I had discovered that Mike's professional identity was completely fabricated, that he was involved in volunteer work he had never mentioned to me, and that the woman he was cheating with was probably someone he had met through that volunteer work. I had also discovered that my mother knew more about the situation than she had admitted, and that she seemed relieved rather than devastated by the cancellation of the wedding. But I still didn't understand the bigger picture. Why had Mike created such an elaborate deception? Why had he proposed to me when he was already involved with Amanda? And why had my mother been so quick to accept the cancellation when she had invested so much time, money, and social capital in making the wedding happen? I looked at my phone and saw that it was almost 3 in the morning. The wedding was supposed to start in 13 hours, and I still hadn't sent the official cancellation messages to our vendors and guests. I was exhausted and emotionally drained, but I knew that the longer I waited, the more difficult it would be to undo all the preparations that had been made. I started with the wedding coordinator, typing out a brief message that explained that the wedding was canceled due to personal circumstances, and that we would be in touch about deposits and cancellation fees. Then I sent similar messages to the caterer, the florist, the photographer, and the band. Each message felt like another nail in the coffin of the life I had thought I was building with Mike. By morning, everyone in Riverside would know that Emma Johnson's wedding had been called off at the last minute, and the speculation about why would probably continue for months. But as I sent each cancellation message, I also felt a strange sense of relief. I was no longer trapped in a relationship with someone who had been lying to me about fundamental aspects of his life. I was no longer committed to building a future with someone who was building a completely different future with someone else. Whatever happened next, at least it would be based on truth rather than deception. The morning sun filtered through the hotel curtains, casting everything in a harsh light that made the previous night feel like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My phone had been buzzing constantly since 6 a.m. with confused text messages from relatives who had driven in from out of town, vendors asking for clarification about the cancellation, and Jessica frantically calling to find out what had happened. I had turned the phone to silent and buried it under a pillow, but I could still see the screen lighting up every few minutes with another incoming call or message. At 7:30, there was a knock on my hotel room door. I ignored it, assuming it was housekeeping or someone from the hotel.
Staff, but the knocking persisted. Finally, a familiar voice called through the door. Emma, it's me. Open up. Jessica. I dragged myself out of bed and unlocked the door, and she immediately pulled me into a hug that made me start crying all over again.
She was already dressed for the wedding in her soft pink maid of honor dress, her hair and makeup perfectly done, which made the reality of the cancellation hit me even harder. "Oh, honey," she said, guiding me back to the bed and sitting down beside me. "I got your text at 5 this morning. I've been calling you for hours. What happened after I left last night?" I told her everything about going to Mike's house and seeing him with the pregnant woman, about the conversation with my mother and her strange reaction to the news, about spending the night researching Mike's background and discovering that nothing about his professional life was what he had claimed it to be. Jessica listened without interrupting, her expression growing more shocked and angry with each new detail. "So, this Amanda woman has no idea that Mike is engaged to you?" she asked when I finished. "As far as I can tell, no. Her social media posts talk about planning a wedding with her fiancé, but she never mentions his name or shows his face in any of the photos. She seems completely happy and excited about their future together." Jessica shook her head in disbelief. "This is insane, Emma. This isn't just cheating. This is like some kind of elaborate con game. Who does something like this? That's what I keep trying to figure out. What's his end game? Why would he propose to me when he's already engaged to someone else who's pregnant with his child? It doesn't make any sense." "And your mother definitely knew something was going on." "She had to have known. Her reaction was way too calm and too quick. She basically said she was relieved that I called off the wedding, which is completely insane considering how much money she spent on it and how much she's been bragging about Mike to everyone at the country club." Jessica was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Emma, what if there's something else going on here? What if your mother didn't just hear rumors about Mike? What if she actually investigated him or hired someone to investigate him?" The idea hadn't occurred to me, but as soon as Jessica said it, it made perfect sense. My mother was a successful real estate agent who was used to doing background checks and verifying information about people before entering into business relationships with them. She was also extremely protective of our family's reputation and social standing. If she had started to suspect that something was wrong with Mike, she would have been exactly the type of person to hire a private investigator rather than just confront him directly. "You think she had him followed?" "I think it's possible. Think about it, Emma. Your mother has spent the last 8 months planning what she's calling the social event of the season. She's invited everyone important in Riverside, she's borrowed money to pay for everything, and she's been telling everyone about what a perfect son-in-law Mike is going to be. If she started having doubts about him, she wouldn't just ignore them and hope for the best. She would want to know exactly what she was dealing with." I thought about my mother's behavior over the past few weeks. She had been asking me more questions about Mike lately, seemingly casual inquiries about his work schedule and his family and his plans for our future. At the time, I assumed she was just excited about the wedding and wanted to get to know him better. But now, those questions seemed more pointed, as if she had been trying to verify information or catch him in inconsistencies. If she hired someone to investigate Mike, then she would have known about Amanda and the pregnancy weeks ago. She would have known that he was lying about his job. She would have known everything. And she let you keep planning the wedding anyway. The implications of that were staggering. If my mother had known that Mike was living a double life, and if she had let me continue with the wedding preparations without warning me, then she had been using me as some kind of pawn in a larger game that I didn't understand. But why would she do that? Why would she let me go through with planning a wedding to someone she knew was lying to me? Jessica looked uncomfortable, as if she had an idea but didn't want to say it out loud. "Emma, what if she was planning to expose him at some point, but not until after she had gotten what she wanted out of the situation?" "What could she possibly want from this situation?" "Think about it. Your mother has spent months telling everyone at the country club about your perfect fiancé and your perfect wedding. She's established herself as someone whose daughter is marrying into exactly the kind of stable and successful family that the country club crowd admires. If she had started having doubts about him, she wouldn't just ignore them and hope for the best. She would want to know exactly what she was dealing with. I thought about my mother's behavior over the past few weeks. She had been asking me more questions about Mike lately, seemingly casual inquiries about his work schedule and his family and his plans for our future. At the time, I assumed she was just excited about the wedding and wanted to get to know him better. But now, those questions seemed more pointed, as if she had been trying to verify information or catch him in inconsistencies. If she hired someone to investigate Mike, then she would have known about Amanda and the pregnancy weeks ago. She would have known that he was lying about his job. She would have known everything. And she let you keep planning the wedding anyway. The implications of that were staggering. If my mother had known that Mike was living a double life, and if she had let me continue with the wedding preparations without warning me, then she had been using me as some kind of pawn in a larger game that I didn't understand. But why would she do that? Why would she let me go through with planning a wedding to someone she knew was lying to me? Jessica looked uncomfortable, as if she had an idea but didn't want to say it out loud. Emma, what if she was planning to expose him at some point, but not until after she had gotten what she wanted out of the situation? What could she possibly want from this situation? Think about it. Your mother has spent months telling everyone at the country club about your perfect fiancé and your perfect wedding. She's established herself as someone whose daughter is marrying into exactly the kind of stable and successful family that the country club crowd admires. If she had started having doubts about him, she wouldn't just ignore them and hope for the best. She would want to know exactly what she was dealing with.
Because his background wouldn't help advance our family's social position. My mother loved me, but she had always seen me as an extension of herself and our family's reputation. If she had discovered that Mike was deceiving me, her first concern would have been figuring out how to handle the situation in a way that made our family look good, not necessarily in a way that protected my feelings. I need to talk to her, I said. I need to know exactly what she knew and when she knew it. Do you want me to come with you? I considered it, but I realized that this was a conversation I needed to have with my mother alone. If she had been manipulating the situation for weeks, I wanted to confront her directly, without any witnesses who might make her more defensive or careful about what she revealed. I think I need to do this by myself. But Jessica, what am I going to tell everyone? Half the guests have probably already arrived in town, and the other half are probably on their way to the church right now. We'll figure that out. The most important thing right now is that you get some answers about what's really been going on. Everything else can wait. After Jessica left, I showered and got dressed in jeans and a sweater, the most normal clothes I could find in my wedding weekend wardrobe. Putting on regular clothes instead of my wedding dress felt like shedding a costume I had been wearing for months, and I realized that I felt more like myself than I had in a long time. The drive to my parents' house took 15 minutes, and I spent the entire time trying to figure out how to approach the conversation with my mother. I couldn't just accuse her of hiring a private investigator or deliberately manipulating the situation without proof, but I also couldn't let her continue to pretend that she had only heard vague rumors about Mike. My parents lived in Maple Grove, one of Riverside's more established neighborhoods, where the houses were large and well-maintained, and the lawns were always perfectly manicured. Their colonial-style home had been my mother's pride and joy for the past 10 years, and she had spent considerable time and money making sure it looked like the kind of house that successful, respectable families lived in. I parked in the driveway and noticed that my father's car was gone, which probably meant he had gone to his office to catch up on work. Bob Johnson was a quiet man who generally avoided family drama by immersing himself in his accounting practice, and he had probably decided that wedding day chaos was something he would rather not be present for. My mother answered the door before I had a chance to knock, as if she had been watching for me from the window.
She was fully dressed and made up despite the early hour, wearing one of her favorite business suits that she usually reserved for important real estate meetings or country club events. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup was flawless, and she looked like someone who was preparing for a performance rather than a family crisis. Emma, sweetheart, come in. I was hoping you would come by this morning. We have so much to discuss. I followed her into the living room, which had been decorated in neutral tones and expensive furniture that was meant to impress visitors. Everything in the room was carefully arranged and spotlessly clean, as if we were expecting a magazine photographer rather than having a family conversation. Mom, I need you to be completely honest with me about what you knew about Mike and when you knew it. She settled into her favorite armchair and folded her hands in her lap, the picture of calm composure. Emma, I told you last night that I had heard some rumors, but I didn't think they were reliable enough to upset you unnecessarily. What specific rumors? From whom? And when did you first hear them? My mother sighed, as if she was reluctant to get into the details, but was willing to do so because I was insisting. About 6 weeks ago, Margaret Henderson mentioned to me at the country club that she thought she had seen Mike around town with a woman who wasn't you. She wasn't sure it was him, and she didn't think much of it at the time, but it made me start paying attention. Margaret Henderson was one of the biggest gossips at the country club, someone who knew everyone's business and wasn't shy about sharing information. If she had mentioned seeing Mike with another woman, it wouldn't have been a casual observation. She would have been certain about what she had seen, and she would have expected my mother to do something with the information. What did you do after Margaret told you that? I started asking around discreetly to see if anyone else had seen anything unusual. It turned out that several people had noticed Mike in the company of a young woman who appeared to be pregnant, but no one wanted to say anything definitive because they weren't completely sure it was him. Several people had seen him with Amanda, and you didn't think that was worth mentioning to me? Emma, I didn't have any proof of anything inappropriate. For all I knew, this woman was a cousin or a family friend or someone who was helping with a volunteer project. I couldn't accuse your fiancé of cheating based on secondhand observations from people who weren't even certain about what they had seen. I could hear the careful phrasing in her response, the way she was presenting herself as someone who had been cautious and responsible, rather than someone who had deliberately withheld important information. But I also noticed that she hadn't answered my question about what she did after hearing the rumors. Mom, did you hire someone to investigate Mike? She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her weighing her options. Finally, she said, I may have asked a friend who works in law enforcement to look into Mike's background, just to make sure there weren't any obvious red flags that we had missed. What kind of friend in law enforcement? Detective Reynolds from Riverside Police Department. He's handled security for several country club events, and he's always been very helpful with background checks for real estate clients. Detective Reynolds. I knew the name because my mother had mentioned him before in the context of her business. He was someone she turned to when she needed to verify information about potential buyers, or when she was concerned about the safety of showing properties to unfamiliar clients. What did Detective Reynolds find out about Mike? He found out that Mike wasn't employed by Riverside Auto Sales, despite what he had told us. He also found out that Mike was involved with the emergency response team and that he had been seen frequently in the company of a woman named Amanda Rodriguez who worked at the hospital. I felt a surge of anger that was stronger than anything I had experienced since this whole nightmare began. So you knew for weeks that Mike was lying?
About his job, and that he was involved with another woman, and you didn't tell me? Emma, I knew that he wasn't working where he said he was working, but that didn't necessarily mean he was lying about everything else. People sometimes exaggerate their job titles or simplify their employment situation when they're trying to make a good impression. And as for the woman, I knew he was spending time with her, but I didn't know the nature of their relationship. Mom, you hired a detective to investigate my fiancé. That's not something you do when you're just curious about job titles. She looked uncomfortable for the first time since I had arrived. Emma, I was trying to protect you, and I was trying to protect our family from a potentially embarrassing situation. By letting me continue planning a wedding to someone you suspected was deceiving me? By gathering enough information to make an informed decision about how to handle the situation. I stared at my mother, trying to process the coldness of her logic. She had treated my engagement like a business deal that needed to be carefully investigated and managed, rather than a relationship that deserved honesty and protection. Mom, what was your plan? Were you going to let me marry Mike and then deal with the consequences later? Were you hoping I would figure out the truth on my own so you wouldn't have to be the one to tell me? I was hoping that if there was an innocent explanation for everything, we could avoid unnecessary drama. And if there wasn't an innocent explanation, I was hoping that the truth would come to light in a way that allowed you to make your own decision about how to proceed. The truth came to light because I happened to go to his house at the right time and saw him with his pregnant fiancée. If I hadn't done that, I would have married him this afternoon without knowing any of this. Emma, I would never have let you marry him if I had been certain that he was deceiving you. I was still gathering information and trying to understand the full scope of the situation. What other information were you gathering? My mother hesitated, and I could see that there was more to the story that she hadn't revealed yet. Detective Reynolds was also looking into Mike's financial situation and his living arrangements. There were some inconsistencies that we wanted to understand better. What kind of inconsistencies? The townhouse he lives in is owned by someone else, and his credit history shows some unusual patterns that didn't match what he had told us about his income and employment. I felt like I was hearing about a stranger rather than the man I had been engaged to for 8 months. Every new piece of information revealed another layer of deception, and I was beginning to wonder if anything Mike had ever told me about himself was true. Mom, how long were you planning to keep investigating him without telling me what you had found? I was planning to talk to you after the wedding if Detective Reynolds found anything definitive. I thought it would be better to let you enjoy your wedding day and then address any concerns afterward if necessary. The casual way she said it made my blood run cold. My mother had been prepared to let me legally bind myself to someone she suspected was living a completely fabricated life and then deal with the fallout later as if it was just another problem to be managed. You were going to let me marry someone you thought might be a con artist? I was going to let you marry someone I hoped would turn out to be exactly who he claimed to be, while making sure I had enough information to protect you if he turned out to be someone else entirely. I realized that my mother saw no fundamental difference between those two approaches. To her, managing risk and protecting appearances was more important than ensuring that I had access to accurate information about the person I was marrying. Mom, what was your plan? Were you going to let me marry Mike and then deal with the consequences later? Were you hoping I would figure out the truth on my own so you wouldn't have to be the one to tell me? I was hoping that if there was an innocent explanation for everything, we could avoid unnecessary drama. And if there wasn't an innocent explanation, I was hoping that the truth would come to light in a way that allowed you to make your own decision about how to proceed. The truth came to light because I happened to go to his house at the right time and saw him with his pregnant fiancée. If I hadn't done that, I would have married him this afternoon without knowing any of this. Emma, I would never have let you marry him if I had been certain that he was deceiving you. I was still gathering information and trying to understand the full scope of the situation. What other information were you gathering? My mother hesitated, and I could see that there was more to the story that she hadn't revealed yet. Detective Reynolds was also looking into Mike's financial situation and his living arrangements. There were some inconsistencies that we wanted to understand better. What kind of inconsistencies? The townhouse he lives in is owned by someone else, and his credit history shows some unusual patterns that didn't match what he had told us about his income and employment. I felt like I was hearing about a stranger rather than the man I had been engaged to for 8 months. Every new piece of information revealed another layer of deception, and I was beginning to wonder if anything Mike had ever told me about himself was true. Mom, how long were you planning to keep investigating him without telling me what you had found? I was planning to talk to you after the wedding if Detective Reynolds found anything definitive. I thought it would be better to let you enjoy your wedding day and then address any concerns afterward if necessary. The casual way she said it made my blood run cold. My mother had been prepared to let me legally bind myself to someone she suspected was living a completely fabricated life and then deal with the fallout later as if it was just another problem to be managed.
You were going to let me marry someone you thought might be a con artist? I was going to let you marry someone I hoped would turn out to be exactly who he claimed to be, while making sure I had enough information to protect you if he turned out to be someone else entirely. I realized that my mother saw no fundamental difference between those two approaches. To her, managing risk and protecting appearances was more important than ensuring that I had access to accurate information about the person I was marrying. Mom, I need you to tell me everything that Detective Reynolds found out about Mike, not just the parts you think are relevant, but everything. She looked at me for a long moment, as if she was calculating whether full honesty was now her best strategy. Finally, she got up and walked to her desk where she pulled out a manila folder that looked like it had been compiled over several weeks. This is everything Detective Reynolds put together. I was planning to give it to you after your honeymoon, if it became necessary. I opened the folder and immediately understood that this wasn't just basic background information. This was a comprehensive investigation that included financial records, employment verification, property searches, and what appeared to be surveillance photos. Detective Reynolds treated Mike Thompson like a criminal suspect rather than a prospective son-in-law. The first document was a summary that laid out the basic findings. Mike Thompson was not employed by Riverside Auto Sales and never had been. His claimed employment history was completely fabricated. The townhouse he lived in was owned by Patricia Rodriguez, who was listed as Amanda Rodriguez's mother. Mike had been living there for approximately 8 months, which was exactly the same amount of time he had been engaged to me. The financial records showed that Mike had no significant income from any legitimate source, but he also had no debt and seemed to have access to money for basic living expenses. There were regular deposits into his bank account from an account registered to Amanda Rodriguez, which suggested that she was supporting him financially. The surveillance photos showed Mike and Amanda together at various locations around Riverside over the past month. They were clearly in a romantic relationship, and in several of the photos, Amanda was visibly pregnant. There were also photos of Mike in his volunteer coordinator uniform, which confirmed that his involvement with the emergency response team was genuine. The most disturbing part of the report was a section that detailed Mike's background before he had arrived in Riverside. According to Detective Reynolds' research, Mike Thompson had lived in 3 different cities over the past 5 years, and in each location, he had been involved in relationships with women who had supported him financially while he maintained fictitious employment. In Columbus, he had been engaged to a lawyer named Jennifer Walsh while simultaneously involved with a doctor named Lisa Chen. Both relationships had ended when the women discovered each other's existence, but by then, Mike had already moved on.
Riverside and begun the pattern again with Amanda and me. I felt sick as I read through the details of his previous relationships. Mike wasn't just someone who had made poor decisions about his personal life. He was someone who systematically targeted successful women and exploited their trust and generosity. The emergency response volunteer work wasn't just a cover story. It was a recruiting ground where he could meet exactly the kind of women who would be attracted to someone who appeared to be dedicated to helping others. Mom, this report is dated 3 weeks ago. You've known all of this for 3 weeks and you didn't tell me? Emma, I wanted to be absolutely certain about the information before I shared it with you. And I wanted to have a plan for how to handle the situation in a way that minimized the impact on our family. What kind of plan? I was working with Detective Reynolds to gather enough evidence to potentially file charges against Mike for fraud or identity theft. If we could have him arrested, it would explain the canceled wedding in a way that made you look like a victim rather than someone who had been fooled by a con artist. I stared at my mother in complete disbelief. She had been planning to have my fiancé arrested as a way of managing our family's public image. The fact that it would also protect other women from being victimized by him was apparently just a side benefit. You were going to have him arrested at our wedding? I was going to have him arrested sometime this weekend, yes. The timing would have depended on when Detective Reynolds felt we had enough evidence to guarantee a conviction. I closed the folder and set it on the coffee table between us. The weight of all this information was overwhelming, but I was also starting to understand the bigger picture of what had been happening over the past few months.
Mom, does Amanda Rodriguez know about any of this? I don't believe so. According to Detective Reynolds, she appears to be as much a victim of Mike's deception as you are. She's pregnant with his child and planning to marry him next month. She needs to know what kind of person he really is. Emma, I think our first priority should be making sure that Mike can't hurt anyone else, including Amanda Rodriguez. Detective Reynolds believes we have enough evidence now to file charges, especially with your testimony about what you witnessed last night. I looked at my mother and realized that even now, in the middle of this crisis, she was thinking strategically about how to control the narrative and minimize the damage to our family's reputation. She had spent weeks planning Mike's downfall instead of simply warning me about what she had discovered. I'm going to talk to Amanda Rodriguez, I said. She deserves to know the truth about who she's planning to marry. Emma, I don't think that's a good idea. If you contact her directly, it could complicate the legal case against Mike. Detective Reynolds thinks it's better to let law enforcement handle the situation from here. I don't care what Detective Reynolds thinks is better for the legal case. I care about making sure that Amanda Rodriguez doesn't marry someone who's going to destroy her life. My mother looked frustrated, as if I was being unnecessarily difficult about a situation she had already figured out how to handle efficiently. Emma, you're not thinking clearly about this. You're emotionally involved, and you're not considering all the implications of the decisions you're making. Mom, the only reason I'm emotionally involved is because you let me get emotionally involved with someone you knew was dangerous. If you had told me 3 weeks ago what you had learned about Mike, I could have ended the relationship then and avoided all of this. If I had told you 3 weeks ago, you would have confronted Mike directly, and he would have disappeared before we could gather enough evidence to stop him from doing this to other women. I realized that there was a fundamental difference in how my mother and I saw this situation. She saw it as a problem to be solved strategically, with careful attention to legal requirements and public relations implications. I saw it as a personal betrayal that had put me and Amanda Rodriguez in danger, and I wanted to prioritize protecting people over building legal cases. I'm going to contact Amanda Rodriguez, I said, and I'm going to tell her everything I know about Mike Thompson. She can decide for herself what she wants to do with that information. Emma, please think about this carefully. Once you contact her, you can't control how she responds or what she does with the information. She might warn Mike, and he might disappear before Detective Reynolds can arrest him. That's a risk I'm willing to take. Amanda Rodriguez is planning to marry Mike next month, and she's pregnant with his child. She needs to know that he's a con artist who's done this to multiple women before her. My mother was quiet for a moment, and I could see her calculating whether there was any way to convince me to follow her preferred approach. Finally, she said, "If you're determined to contact her, then I think you should at least coordinate with Detective Reynolds so that he can be prepared to take Mike into custody as soon as possible after she learns the truth." It wasn't the response I had wanted, but it was probably the best compromise I was going to get from my mother. And the truth was that I did want Mike to face legal consequences for what he had done, both to me and to the other women he had victimized. I just wanted to make sure that Amanda Rodriguez was protected first. Fine, I'll call Detective Reynolds and let him know what I'm planning to do. But I'm not going to wait weeks for him to build the perfect legal case. Amanda deserves to know the truth now. Emma, I want you to know that everything I did was because I love you and I wanted to protect you. I may have made some mistakes in how I handled the situation, but my intentions were good. I looked at my mother and saw someone who genuinely believed that her approach had been reasonable and protective. She had discovered that my fiancé was a con artist, and instead of warning me immediately, she had spent weeks building a legal case against him while allowing me to continue planning a wedding that was based on lies. In her mind, she had been protecting me from embarrassment and protecting our family from scandal. In my mind, she was protecting herself from having to admit that she had failed to properly vet the man that she had approved of as my future husband. Mom, I understand that you thought you were protecting me, but what you actually did was let me continue to build an emotional investment in someone you knew was dangerous. That's not protection, that's manipulation. Emma, I never intended for you to be hurt by this situation. But you were willing to let me be hurt if it meant that you could control how and when I would hurt.
When the truth came out, she didn't respond to that, which was probably the closest thing to an admission I was going to get from her. I picked up the folder with Detective Reynolds' report and stood up to leave. I'm going to contact Amanda Rodriguez this afternoon, and then I'm going to decide what I want to do about Mike and about all of this. Emma, please be careful. Mike Thompson is not the man either of us thought he was, and we don't know how he might react when he realizes that his deception has been discovered. As I drove away from my parents' house, I thought about my mother's warning. She was right that I didn't know how Mike might react to being exposed. But I also knew that I couldn't live with myself if I didn't warn Amanda Rodriguez about what she was getting involved with. The Mike Thompson I had fallen in love with had probably never existed, but Amanda Rodriguez was a real person who was about to make a life-changing mistake, and I had the power to prevent that from happening. Whatever the consequences, I was going to tell her the truth. Amanda Rodriguez answered her phone on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful in a way that made my heart ache for what I was about to destroy. Hello, this is Amanda? Hi, Amanda. My name is Emma Johnson. I'm calling because I have some information about Mike Thompson that I think you need to know. The silence that followed stretched so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was cautious and confused. I'm sorry, who did you say you were? My name is Emma Johnson, and until yesterday, I was engaged to Mike Thompson. I discovered last night that he's also engaged to you, and I think we need to talk. I heard her sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like her sitting down heavily. I don't understand. Mike isn't engaged to anyone else. We're getting married next month. Amanda, I know this is shocking, but I'm telling you the truth. Mike and I were supposed to get married today. I have photos, documentation, everything. But more importantly, I have information about Mike's background that suggests this isn't the first time he's done something like this. This has to be some kind of mistake. Mike wouldn't... He's not that kind of person. The pain in her voice was exactly what I had felt 12 hours earlier, when my world had collapsed around me. Amanda, I know how impossible this sounds. I felt the same way when I discovered the truth. But I think you deserve to know what I've learned about him before you make any permanent decisions. What kind of information? I took a deep breath and told her about Detective Reynolds' investigation, about Mike's pattern of relationships in other cities, about the fabricated employment history, and the systematic way he targeted professional women through volunteer work. I tried to be gentle but thorough, giving her enough detail that she could verify the information on her own if she chose to. Amanda was quiet through most of my explanation, occasionally asking for clarification about dates or details. When I finished, she was silent for so long that I began to worry she had hung up. Amanda, are you still there? I'm here. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I'm just trying to process all of this. You're saying that Mike has done this before? With other women? According to the investigation, yes, in at least 2 other cities over the past 5 years. The pattern is always the same. He gets involved with volunteer work, meets professional women, creates fake stories about his career,
and then maintains relationships with multiple women while letting them support him financially. But Mike doesn't let me support him. He contributes to our household expenses. Amanda, do you mind if I ask where Mike gets his money? What does he tell you about his job? Another long pause. He says he works for a consulting firm that specializes in emergency preparedness for businesses. He travels a lot for work, which is why his schedule is so irregular. I felt sick hearing how similar his lies to Amanda were to the lies he had told me. Different details, but the same basic structure of a flexible, professional job that explained his irregular schedule and frequent absences. Amanda, I've seen the financial records that Detective Reynolds compiled. Mike has no income from any consulting firm. The money he's been giving you appears to come from his previous relationships and possibly from other sources that haven't been identified yet. That's impossible. Mike isn't a criminal. He volunteers with the emergency response team. He helps people. I know he volunteers with the emergency response team. That's how he met you, isn't it? Yes, but that doesn't mean people don't volunteer to help others just so they can take advantage of them. Amanda, I don't think Mike started volunteering in order to meet women to exploit. I think he genuinely cares about helping people. But I also think he's someone who's capable of compartmentalizing his life in ways that most people can't. He can be a dedicated volunteer and a caring partner to you while simultaneously living completely separate lives with other people. I could hear her crying softly, and I wish I could be there in person to support her through this conversation. Delivering devastating news over the phone felt cruel, but I hadn't known how else to reach her quickly. Amanda, I know this is overwhelming, but I think you should know that there's going to be a legal investigation into Mike's activities. Detective Reynolds believes there's enough evidence to file fraud charges against him. Fraud charges? For identity theft, financial fraud, and possibly other charges related to his pattern of deception. Your mother knew about this? I explained about my mother's investigation and her decision to gather evidence rather than warn me immediately. Amanda listened in stunned silence as I described the weeks of surveillance and background checks that had revealed the full scope of Mike's deception. So, your family has known for weeks that Mike was lying to both of us, and they didn't tell either of us? My mother didn't tell me because she wanted to build a legal case against him first. I found out by accident last night when I saw you and Mike together at his house. You saw us together? I went to his townhouse to talk to him about some concerns I had been having, and I saw you both through the window. That's when I realized that everything he had told me about his life was a lie. Amanda was quiet again, and I could hear her moving around, probably pacing or trying to find somewhere private to continue our conversation. Amanda, can I ask you something? Of course. When you were with Mike, did he seem genuine? Like he really cared about you? The question caught me off guard because it was exactly what I had been wondering about.
Myself. Yes, he did. That's what made this so confusing. Mike seemed like he genuinely loved me and was excited about our future together. He wasn't just going through the motions or acting like someone who was running a con. He seemed emotionally invested in our relationship. That's how he is with me, too. He talks about our future, about the baby, about the kind of life we're going to build together. It doesn't feel fake or manipulative. I know, and that's what makes this so disturbing. Either Mike is an incredibly skilled actor, or he's someone who's capable of genuinely caring about multiple people simultaneously while lying to all of them about fundamental aspects of his life. Or he's someone who's in such deep psychological trouble that he doesn't even understand what he's doing. That possibility hadn't occurred to me, but it made more sense than the idea that Mike was a cold, calculating predator. The Mike I had known was empathetic and caring, someone who seemed genuinely troubled when other people were in pain. It was hard to reconcile that person with someone who would deliberately destroy multiple women's lives for financial gain. Amanda, what are you going to do with this information?
I don't know yet. I need to process it first, and I need to figure out how to verify what you've told me. But Emma, can I ask you another favor? Sure. Can you send me copies of the detective's report? I want to see the evidence for myself before I make any decisions about how to handle this. I agreed to email her the documents, and we exchanged contact information. Before we hung up, Amanda asked me one more question that I hadn't expected. Emma, are you okay? I mean, you were supposed to get married today, and instead you're dealing with all of this. How are you holding up? Her concern for my well-being, even while she was processing her own devastating news, made me understand why Mike had been drawn to her. Amanda Rodriguez was the kind of person who instinctively cared about others, even when she was going through her own crisis. I'm not okay yet, but I think I will be. And Amanda, I want you to know that I'm not trying to hurt you by telling you this. I just couldn't live with myself if I didn't warn you about what you might be getting into. I know, and Emma, thank you for calling me. I can't imagine how difficult this conversation was for you, especially today. After we hung up, I sat in my car outside my parents' house for a long time, thinking about Amanda and Mike and the impossible complexity of the situation we were all trapped in. Amanda seemed like a genuinely good person who was about to become a single mother because the father of her child was living a completely fabricated life. Mike seemed like someone who was capable of real love and genuine care for others, but who was also capable of a systematic deception on a scale that was almost impossible to comprehend. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Detective Reynolds. Ms. Johnson, your mother told me that you contacted Amanda Rodriguez this afternoon. I want to make sure you understand the implications of that decision. Detective Reynolds, I understand that contacting Amanda might complicate your investigation, but I couldn't let her marry Mike without knowing the truth about who he is. Ms. Johnson, I'm not calling to criticize your decision. I'm calling because Amanda Rodriguez contacted our department an hour ago and asked to speak with me about Mike Thompson. She wants to cooperate with the investigation. I felt a surge of relief. Amanda had taken the information seriously and was doing exactly what I had hoped she would do. What did she tell you? She confirmed several details about Mike's behavior that support our fraud case. She also provided us with financial records and communications that we didn't have before. Her cooperation significantly strengthens our ability to prosecute him. Are you going to arrest him? We're planning to take him into custody tomorrow morning. Ms. Rodriguez has agreed to help us arrange a meeting with him so that we can arrest him safely and without causing a public disturbance. How is Amanda handling all of this? She's understandably upset, but she's also angry about being deceived, and she wants to make sure that Mike can't do this to anyone else. She asked me to tell you that she appreciates you reaching out to her, and she wants to talk to you again after we've arrested Mike. The next morning, I woke up in my hotel room to a text message from Detective Reynolds confirming that Mike had been arrested without incident. He had been charged with multiple counts of fraud and identity theft, and he was being held pending a bail hearing. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness reading the news. Relief that Mike would face consequences for what he had done, and that other women would be protected from his deception. But also sadness for the relationship I thought I had with him, and for the future I thought we were building together. Jessica arrived at my hotel room an hour later with coffee and bagels and a plan for getting me through what should have been my wedding day. "So what's the plan?" she asked, settling into the chair by the window. "Do you want to hide in this hotel room and pretend today doesn't exist? Do you want to go somewhere and get dramatically drunk? Do you want to do something completely different that has nothing to do with weddings or Mike Thompson?" I thought about it for a moment. 24 hours ago, I had been planning to spend today celebrating the beginning of my married life with someone I loved. Now I was trying to figure out how to process the discovery that the person I loved had never really existed. I think I want to go see Amanda. I want to make sure she's okay, and I want to understand more about who Mike really is. If we're both going through this, maybe we can help each other figure out how to move forward. Jessica looked surprised, but not disapproving. "Are you sure that's a good idea? It might be really painful to spend time with someone who's also been hurt by Mike." It might be, but it might also be helpful to talk to someone who understands what it feels like to discover that someone you trusted was lying to you about everything. Amanda lived in a small apartment complex near the hospital where she worked as a pediatric nurse. When I knocked on her door that afternoon, she answered immediately, as if she had been waiting by the window for me to arrive. She was visibly pregnant, probably about 6 months along, and she looked exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. Her eyes were red from crying, but she smiled when she saw me, a genuine expression of gratitude that made me glad I had decided to come. Emma, thank you for coming. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I have so many questions.
About Mike, and about how this whole situation happened. I followed her into her living room, which was decorated simply but warmly. There were medical textbooks stacked on the coffee table, baby clothes folded in a basket by the couch, and photos on the walls of Amanda with friends and family. It looked like the home of someone who was building a stable, purposeful life, and I could see why Mike would have been attracted to her strength and independence. Amanda, how are you handling all of this? Are you okay? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm definitely not okay. I found out yesterday that the father of my child is a criminal who's been lying to me about everything for the past 8 months. But I'm handling it. I think. I have to handle it. Do you have family who can help you? Friends who can support you through this? I have some family in Columbus, and I have friends here, but most of them don't know about Mike yet. I haven't figured out how to explain this situation to people. What do you say? Hi, remember my fiancé who you met a few times? Well, it turns out he's a con artist who was engaged to someone else the whole time we were together. I understood exactly what she meant. The social embarrassment of having been so thoroughly deceived was almost as difficult to process as the emotional betrayal. Amanda, can I ask you about Mike's behavior when you were together? Did he ever do anything that seemed strange or inconsistent? She thought for a moment. There were little things that I noticed, but didn't think much about at the time. He was very secretive about his phone and his computer. He never wanted me to visit him at work. He was vague about his family and his background, but he explained all of those things in ways that seemed reasonable. What kind of explanations? He said his job involved confidential client information, so he couldn't discuss it in detail or have visitors at his office. He said his family was very private and didn't like to get involved in his personal relationships. He said he preferred to focus on our future together rather than dwelling on his past. I nodded, recognizing the same pattern of explanations that Mike had given me. He was skilled at providing just enough information to satisfy immediate curiosity while deflecting deeper questions about the areas of his life that would have revealed his deception. Did you ever meet his family? I met his mother once, briefly, when she was visiting town, but it was a very short meeting and Mike seemed eager to keep it that way. He said she was dealing with some health issues and didn't have the energy for extended social visits. What was she like? She seemed nice, but also kind of nervous or uncomfortable. At the time, I thought it was because she was meeting her son's girlfriend for the first time and wasn't sure what to think of me. Now I wonder if she was nervous because she knew something about Mike that I didn't. I thought about Mike's mother and wondered how much she knew about her son's activities. If Mike had been living this kind of double life for years, his family might have been aware of his pattern of behavior even if they didn't know the specific details of his current situation. Amanda, did you think Mike actually cared about us, or do you think it was all just an act? She was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the parking lot. That's what I keep trying to figure out. When Mike and I were together, it felt real. He seemed genuinely interested in my work, my thoughts, my plans for the future. He seemed excited about the baby and about becoming a father. If it was all an act, then he's an incredibly talented actor. But maybe it wasn't entirely an act. Maybe Mike is someone who's capable of genuinely caring about multiple people at the same time, even while he's lying to all of them. You mean like he compartmentalized his emotions the same way he compartmentalized his life? Exactly. Maybe the Mike that was with you was real, and the Mike that was with me was real, but he kept those versions of himself completely separate so that he didn't have to deal with the contradictions. Amanda nodded slowly. That would explain why he seemed so genuine with both of us. He wasn't acting like someone who cared about us. He actually cared about us. He just couldn't figure out how to be honest about the complexity of his situation.
Or he was too scared to be honest because he knew that honesty would mean losing everyone. We spent the next hour sharing stories about our relationships with Mike, comparing the details of what he had told each of us, and trying to piece together a more complete picture of who he really was. What emerged was a portrait of someone who was deeply conflicted and possibly struggling with psychological issues that he didn't know how to address in healthy ways. Mike had been genuinely dedicated to his volunteer work with the emergency response team. Multiple people had confirmed that he was reliable, competent, and caring in his role as a coordinator. He had helped train new volunteers, organize successful fundraising events, and responded to actual emergencies with skill and compassion. But he had also constructed elaborate lies about every other aspect of his life, maintaining those lies with such consistency and detail that even people who knew him well had no idea that his professional identity was completely fabricated. Amanda, do you think Mike is someone who needs help rather than someone who needs to be punished? I think he needs both. What he did to us and to those other women was wrong and harmful. People have to face consequences for that kind of behavior. But I also think he's someone who's struggling with issues that he doesn't know how to handle in healthy ways. Do you think there's any chance that he could change? That he could get help and learn how to have honest relationships? I don't know. I want to believe that people can change, especially since he's going to be my child's father, regardless of what happens between us. But I also know
That I can't base my decisions on hope that he might become someone different. As the afternoon wore on, Amanda and I talked about our plans for moving forward. She was planning to stay in Riverside for now, since she had a good job and a support network there. She was also planning to raise her child as a single mother, at least until Mike could demonstrate that he was capable of being honest and reliable. I was planning to take some time off from work to process everything that had happened and figure out what I wanted to do next. The wedding cancellation had been financially devastating for my family, and my relationship with my mother was going to need a lot of work before it could be repaired. But I was also feeling something I hadn't expected: relief. The relationship I had thought I wanted had been based on lies and deception. The future I had been planning had been built on a foundation that never really existed. Discovering the truth about Mike had been devastating, but it had also freed me from a life that would have been much worse than being single. Emma, can I ask you something personal? Sure. Do you think you'll be able to trust someone again after all of this? I thought about her question seriously. I think so, eventually. But I think I'm going to be much more careful about investigating people's backgrounds and verifying the things they tell me about themselves. I trusted Mike completely, and that was a mistake. I've been thinking about that too. Part of me feels like I should have known something was wrong. There were signs that I ignored because I wanted to believe that I had found someone who was genuinely good. Amanda, I don't think either of us should blame ourselves for trusting someone who seemed trustworthy. Mike was very skilled at creating a believable persona. The fact that we believed him doesn't make us naive or stupid. It makes us normal people who expected honesty from someone we cared about. Before I left that evening, Amanda asked if I would be willing to stay in touch as we both navigated the legal proceedings and the emotional aftermath of Mike's arrest. I agreed immediately, grateful to have someone who understood what I was going through. 6 months later, Mike Thompson was sentenced to 3 years in prison for fraud and identity theft. He had pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence, and he had agreed to pay restitution to the women he had deceived. Amanda gave birth to a healthy daughter named Sophia, and she was building a good life as a single mother with the support of her family and friends. She had decided not to pursue any kind of relationship with Mike while he was in prison, but she hadn't ruled out the possibility of co-parenting with him in the future if he could demonstrate genuine change. I had moved to a new apartment across town and started seeing a therapist to help me process the experience of being deceived so thoroughly by someone I loved. The therapy was helping me understand how the relationship with Mike had affected my ability to trust my own judgment, and I was slowly rebuilding my confidence in my ability to make good decisions about the people I let into my life.
My relationship with my mother was still complicated. We were talking regularly, but I was having trouble forgiving her for the way she had handled the situation with Mike. She maintained that she had been trying to protect me, but I felt that she had prioritized her own interests over my safety and well-being. The most unexpected outcome of the whole experience was the friendship I had developed with Amanda. We talked regularly, and we had helped each other process the emotional aftermath of discovering that someone we loved had been living a completely fabricated life. Having someone who understood exactly what I had been through had been invaluable in my recovery. Looking back on the experience, I realized that discovering Mike's deception had been one of the most painful and disorienting experiences of my life, but it had also taught me important lessons about the difference between love and manipulation, between trust and naivety, and between protecting someone and controlling them. I had learned that it was possible to genuinely care about someone while simultaneously lying to them about fundamental aspects of your life. I had learned that people were capable of compartmentalizing their emotions and their behavior in ways that allowed them to maintain contradictory relationships without experiencing the psychological distress that most people would feel in those circumstances. Most importantly, I had learned that discovering the truth about someone, even when that truth was devastating, was always better than living a life based on lies and deception. The wedding that never happened had saved me from a marriage that would have been built on a foundation of systematic dishonesty. Sometimes the worst day of your life turns out to be the day that saves you from something much worse. Sometimes the person who breaks your heart is actually setting you free to find something real. And sometimes the truth that destroys everything you thought you wanted is the truth that allows you to build something better. If you've ever been deceived by someone you trusted completely, if you've ever discovered that a relationship you valued was based on lies, if you've ever had to rebuild your life after learning that someone you loved was not who they claimed to be, then you know that recovery is possible. Trust can be rebuilt, judgment can be refined, and love can be found again with someone who deserves it. The most important thing I learned from my experience with Mike Thompson was that authentic love requires authentic honesty. A relationship built on deception, no matter how caring or passionate it might feel, will always collapse eventually under the weight of its own contradictions. When that collapse happens, the best thing you can do is tell the truth to everyone who needs to hear it, protect the people who are still in danger, and focus on building a future that's based on reality rather than fantasy. Sometimes the greatest act of love is warning someone about the person you both love. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is destroying a beautiful lie in order to protect someone from living it. And sometimes, when everything falls apart, you discover that you're stronger than you thought you were, and that the truth, no matter how painful, is always worth fighting for. 3 weeks after Mike's arrest, I received an unexpected phone call that would change everything I thought I understood about the situation. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize with a Columbus area code, and when I answered, a woman's voice asked if I was Emma Johnson. Yes, this is Emma. Ms. Johnson, my name is Patricia Rodriguez. I'm Amanda's mother. I was wondering if we could meet sometime soon. There are some things about Mike Thompson.
I think you and Amanda need to know. Patricia Rodriguez sounded older and more tired than I had expected, and there was something in her voice that suggested she had been carrying a heavy burden for a long time. When I asked what kind of information she wanted to share, she said it would be better to discuss it in person, and she offered to drive to Riverside that weekend to meet with Amanda and me together. Amanda was initially hesitant about meeting with her mother to discuss Mike. Their relationship had been strained since Amanda's pregnancy, partly because Patricia had been skeptical of Mike from the beginning and had expressed concerns that Amanda had interpreted as disapproval of her choices. But when I explained that Patricia claimed to have important information about Mike's background, Amanda agreed that we should hear what she had to say. We met at a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of Riverside, away from the downtown area where people might recognize us and ask questions about the wedding cancellation.
Patricia Rodriguez was a small, dignified woman in her early 60s who worked as a school administrator in Columbus. She had driven down alone, and she looked nervous as she settled into the booth across from Amanda and me. "Before I tell you what I know about Mike Thompson," Patricia began, "I want you both to understand that I've been struggling with whether to share this information ever since Amanda told me about his arrest. What I'm about to tell you doesn't excuse what he did to either of you, but it might help you understand why he became the kind of person who could live such a complicated lie." Amanda reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "Mom, whatever it is, we can handle it. We've already been through the worst of this." Patricia took a deep breath and pulled out a manila envelope that she had been clutching since she arrived. "3 years ago, Mike Thompson contacted me through the hospital where I used to work as a patient advocate. He said he was looking for information about a patient who had been treated there in the 1990s, a little boy named Michael Chen, who had been in a serious car accident." I felt my stomach drop. The name Michael Chen was too close to the identity Mike had been using to be a coincidence. "Patricia, are you saying that Mike Thompson isn't his real name?" "I'm saying that the man you both knew as Mike Thompson was born Michael Chen, and he was my patient 28 years ago when he was 7 years old." Amanda stared at her mother in shock. "You knew Mike when he was a child?" "I knew him during the worst period of his life. Michael Chen was brought to our hospital after a car accident that killed both of his parents and left him with severe injuries and traumatic brain damage. He spent 6 months in our pediatric intensive care unit, and I was the advocate assigned to his case." Patricia opened the envelope and pulled out medical records, newspaper clippings, and photographs that she spread across the table. The photos showed a small, dark-haired boy in a hospital bed, connected to multiple machines and bandaged extensively. Even with the injuries, I could see the resemblance to the man I had known as Mike Thompson. Michael's injuries were primarily to his frontal lobe, which is the part of the brain that controls personality, decision-making, and the ability to understand social consequences. The doctors weren't sure he would survive, and when he did survive, they warned his extended family that he might never be the same person he had been before the accident. I studied the medical records, trying to understand the implications of what Patricia was telling us. "Are you saying that Mike's ability to lie and manipulate people is the result of brain damage?" "I'm saying that traumatic brain injury, especially to the frontal lobe, can affect someone's ability to understand the difference between truth and fiction and their capacity to predict how their actions will affect other people. It doesn't excuse dishonest behavior, but it can explain why someone might engage in patterns of behavior that seem incomprehensible to people with normal brain function." Amanda was studying the photographs intently. "What happened to him after he recovered from the accident?" "He was placed with his maternal aunt and uncle in Toledo, but the placement didn't work out well. Michael's behavior became increasingly difficult as he got older. He would tell elaborate stories that weren't true. He would form intense attachments to people and then disappear without explanation. And he seemed unable to understand why his actions hurt the people who cared about him." Patricia pulled out more documents that showed Michael's placement history through the foster care system. He had been moved multiple times throughout his adolescence, usually because his caretakers became frustrated with his unpredictable behavior and his tendency to create chaos in their households. By the time he aged out of the foster care system at 18, Michael had learned to be very charming and very good at telling people what they wanted to hear. But he had never learned how to form stable, honest relationships or how to take responsibility for the consequences of his actions. I thought about the Mike that I had known, with his easy charm and his ability to make people feel special and understood. "Patricia, when Mike contacted you 3 years ago, what did he want to know about his medical history?" "He said he was trying to understand why he had so much trouble with relationships and why he seemed to hurt everyone he cared about. He had started to realize that something was wrong with the way his brain worked, and he wanted to know if his problems were related to his childhood injuries. What did you tell him? I explained what I could about his medical history and the potential long-term effects of his brain injury. I also gave him referrals to neurologists and therapists who specialize in treating adults with traumatic brain injuries. I encouraged him to seek professional help to learn coping strategies for managing his symptoms. Amanda looked up from the medical records. Did he follow up on those referrals? He contacted one of the neurologists I recommended, Dr. Sarah Martinez at Ohio State Medical Center. She did a comprehensive evaluation and confirmed that Michael was still experiencing significant effects from his childhood brain injury. She recommended cognitive behavioral therapy and medication to help him manage his symptoms. Did he follow through with the treatment? Patricia's expression became sad and frustrated. He started the therapy, but he stopped going after a few months. Dr. Martinez told me that he seemed to want to understand his condition, but he wasn't willing to do the hard work of changing his behavior patterns. I felt a complex mix of emotions as I processed this information. On the one hand, learning that Mike's deceptive behavior might be the result of brain damage
Related to brain damage made me feel sympathy for him and helped explain the contradictions in his personality. On the other hand, knowing that he had been aware of his condition and had chosen not to pursue treatment made his actions seem even more irresponsible. Patricia, why are you telling us this now? Why didn't you contact Amanda when you found out she was involved with Mike? Because I wasn't sure it was the same person at first. Michael Chen had been using different names and identities for years, and I wasn't certain that the Mike Thompson that Amanda was dating was the little boy I had known at the hospital. It wasn't until I saw his photo in the newspaper after his arrest that I was completely sure. Amanda was quiet for a long time, staring at the medical records and trying to reconcile this new information with everything she thought she knew about Mike. Finally, she asked the question that I had been thinking about since Patricia started her story. Mom, if Mike has brain damage that affects his ability to understand right from wrong, does that mean he's not really responsible for what he did to us? Patricia considered the question carefully before answering. Honey, having a brain injury explains why someone might have trouble with impulse control and social judgment, but it doesn't excuse deliberate choices to hurt other people. Michael knew that he had problems with honesty and relationships. He had been given information about his condition and resources for getting help. He chose not to pursue treatment, and he chose to continue engaging in behavior that he knew was harmful to others. But if his brain doesn't work the same way as other people's brains, can we really say that he chose to be deceptive? Maybe he literally can't help himself. Amanda, I've worked with many patients who have traumatic brain injuries, and while their conditions affect their behavior, they're still capable of learning right from wrong and making better choices when they're given the right support and treatment. The fact that Michael was able to function well in his volunteer work shows that he's capable of appropriate behavior when he chooses to be. I thought about Mike's dedication to the emergency response team and his genuine care for the people he helped during crises. So he was able to be honest and reliable in his volunteer work, but not in his personal relationships? That's not uncommon for people with frontal lobe damage. They can often function well in structured environments with clear rules and expectations, but they struggle in situations that require complex social judgment and long-term planning. Patricia pulled out one more document from her envelope, a letter that appeared to be handwritten. Before I leave today, there's something else I want to show you. This is a letter that Michael wrote to me 6 months ago after Amanda told him she was pregnant. Amanda's eyes widened. Mike wrote to you about me? He wrote to me because he was panicking about becoming a father. He was terrified that his brain injury would affect his ability to be a good parent, and he wanted to know if there was any chance that his condition could be passed on to his child. Patricia handed the letter to Amanda, who read it silently while tears ran down her face. When she finished, she passed it to me, and I read Mike's desperate, confused words about his fear of hurting his child the way he had hurt everyone else in his life. The letter revealed someone who was deeply aware of his own destructive patterns, but felt helpless to change them.
Mike wrote about his love for Amanda and his excitement about the baby, but also about his terror that his inability to be honest would eventually destroy their family. He begged Patricia for advice about whether he should tell Amanda about his medical history and his previous relationships, or whether it would be better to disappear from her life before he could cause more damage. "He knew," Amanda whispered. "He knew he was going to hurt me, and he stayed anyway." "Honey, I think he stayed because he loved you, and he hoped that this time would be different. But I also think he stayed because his brain injury makes it very difficult for him to anticipate the long-term consequences of his actions. He could see that his behavior was problematic, but he couldn't fully understand how devastating it would be when the truth came out." Patricia gathered up the documents and photos, preparing to leave. "I wanted you both to have this information because I think it's important for you to understand that Michael's actions weren't necessarily calculated or malicious. He's a damaged person who never learned how to have healthy relationships, and he's caused tremendous pain to people he genuinely cares about." "But Patricia," I said, "what does this mean for us moving forward? If Mike has a medical condition that affects his behavior, does that change how we should think about what happened?" "I think it means that you can understand why he did what he did without excusing it or allowing it to continue. Michael needs professional help to learn how to manage his condition, and he needs to take responsibility for getting that help and changing his behavior. Until he does that, he's not safe to be in relationships with." After Patricia left, Amanda and I sat in the restaurant for another hour trying to process what we had learned. The revelation that Mike's deceptive behavior might be related to childhood brain trauma added a layer of complexity to our situation that neither of us had anticipated. "Emmett, does knowing about Mike's brain injury change how you feel about what happened between you two?" I thought about it carefully. It makes me feel sad for him in a way that I didn't before, and it helps me understand why he seemed so genuine even while he was lying to me. But it doesn't change the fact that he chose not to get help for his condition, and it doesn't change the fact that he hurt both of us. I keep thinking about that letter he wrote to my mother. He knew he was going to hurt me, but he stayed anyway. That feels almost worse than if he had been deliberately trying to deceive me. Why does it feel worse? Because it means he cared enough about me to be terrified of hurting me, but he didn't care enough about me to get help or be honest with me. He chose his own comfort over my safety. I understood what Amanda meant. Learning that Mike had been aware of his problems and had chosen not to address them made his actions feel more selfish rather than less so. If he had been a cold, calculating predator, his behavior would have been easier to understand and dismiss. But knowing that he was someone who genuinely cared about us while simultaneously betraying us made the situation more painful and more complicated. Emma, does knowing about Mike's brain injury change how you feel about being Sophia's father? I don't know yet. Part of me feels like I
Should tell him that I know about his medical history and encourage him to get the help he needs. But part of me thinks that he's had years to address his condition, and if he hasn't done it by now, he's probably not going to do it. Do you think you would ever consider having a relationship with him again if he got proper treatment? Amanda was quiet for a long time. Maybe. If he could demonstrate that he had really changed and that he was capable of being honest and reliable. But I think it would take years of consistent good behavior before I could trust him again. And I'm not sure I want to spend years of my life waiting to see if someone can become the person I thought they were. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from Mike in prison. He had learned somehow that Amanda and I had been in contact, and he wanted to explain his actions and apologize for the pain he had caused. The letter was 7 pages long, and it revealed someone who was struggling to understand his own behavior while taking responsibility for the harm he had caused. Mike wrote that he had known about his brain injury for 3 years, and he had known that it affected his ability to have honest relationships. He had started therapy twice, but had quit both times because confronting his problems was too painful and overwhelming. He wrote that he had convinced himself that his relationships with Amanda and me were different from his previous relationships, and that he would be able to be honest with us eventually. He explained that he had planned to tell both of us the truth about his situation after we were all married, believing that legal commitment would make us more likely to work through the problems rather than leave him. He acknowledged that this plan was selfish and unrealistic, but he said that his brain injury made it difficult for him to understand why the plan wouldn't work.
The letter included an apology that seemed genuine and detailed, acknowledging specific ways that his actions had hurt us and accepting full responsibility for the consequences. Mike wrote that he was using his time in prison to participate in therapy and learn better coping strategies for managing his condition. He said that he understood if neither of us ever wanted to see him again, but he hoped that someday he could prove that he had changed. I shared the letter with Amanda, and we discussed whether we should respond to it. Ultimately, we decided that while we appreciated his apology, we weren't ready to resume contact with him. We both needed more time to heal from the experience, and we weren't convinced that Mike was capable of the kind of sustained change that would make a relationship with him safe or healthy. 6 months later, Amanda gave birth to Sofia Rodriguez, a healthy baby girl who looked exactly like her mother, but had Mike's dark eyes and serious expression. Amanda had decided to give Sofia her own last name rather than Mike's, and she was raising her daughter as a single mother with the support of her family and friends. I had returned to work and started dating again, though I was much more cautious about trusting people and more thorough about verifying the information that potential partners shared with me. The experience with Mike had taught me the importance of looking for consistency between someone's words and actions, and of paying attention to red flags rather than explaining them away. My relationship with my mother had improved somewhat, though we were still working through the trust issues created by her decision to investigate Mike without telling me. We had started family therapy together, and Linda was slowly learning to be more direct and honest in her communication rather than trying to manage situations behind the scenes. Amanda and I had remained close friends, bonded by our shared experience and our mutual commitment to protecting Sofia from any potential harm that Mike might cause in the future. We had both testified at his trial, and we had both been satisfied with his conviction and sentencing. The most important thing I learned from the entire experience was that love without honesty is not really love at all. Mike may have genuinely cared about Amanda and I, but his inability to be truthful with us meant that the relationships we thought we had with him were based on illusions rather than reality. Understanding that Mike's deceptive behavior was related to brain damage helped me have compassion for him as a person while still holding him accountable for his choices. Brain injury might explain why someone struggles with honesty and social judgment, but it doesn't excuse the decision to avoid treatment or to continue harmful behavior. I also learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their destructive patterns. By calling off the wedding and exposing Mike's deception, Amanda and I had forced him to confront the consequences of his actions in a way that might ultimately motivate him to get the help he needed. Whether Mike would actually change remained to be seen, but Amanda, Sofia, and I were all better off knowing the truth about who he was, rather than continuing to live in relationships based on lies and manipulation. The wedding that never happened had saved us all from years of pain and confusion. Sometimes the most devastating moment of your life is actually the moment that sets you free to build something real and authentic. If you've ever been in a relationship with someone who seemed to genuinely care about you while simultaneously lying to you about fundamental aspects of their life, you know how confusing and painful that experience can be. The key to recovery is understanding that you can have compassion for someone's struggles without excusing their harmful behavior, and that you can love someone while still protecting yourself from their dysfunction. Trust can be rebuilt, but only with people who demonstrate through consistent actions that they are committed to honesty and growth. And sometimes the greatest act of love is walking away from someone who is not yet capable of the kind of authentic relationship that you deserve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.